Hi there! In this video I want to talk about how the ATAR is calculated. We'll go through all the steps, through the moderation, through the scaling process, and then how the final ATAR scores are actually figured out. So let's get to it. To help us think through the scaling process and the ATAR process, we're going to follow Mary through her HSC journey, starting at year 10 where she's at now, choosing her subjects and getting prepared, and through the preliminary and the HSC course. Mary has set herself an ATAR goal of 90. She doesn't really know what she wants to study yet. There are a few things she's interested in, and she knows that there are lots of other pathways to university, but she would like to keep them as open as possible, and she thinks that 90 is an ATAR that's achievable for her, and so she wants to investigate how to make that work for her. Mary has worked hard throughout year 11, and she completes her preliminary studies. But at the end of it, she realises that 13 units is a lot, and she'd like to drop something. So after talking to her teachers and her parents and taking some advice and not taking other advice, she decides that probably the best subject for her to drop is modern history. And so she goes into her HSC studies with 11 units, having dropped her modern history course. So now Mary has finished her HSC courses as well. All her assessments are done, her trials are done. All that she's waiting for now is to complete her exams. Mary doesn't know the marks that her school will send away to NISA, but she does know her rankings. And what I hear often from people is that it's the rankings that matter, not the marks. It's kind of true. It's a bit of a simplification. What matters is, one, where you rank in your course in your school, not your classes, but your whole school for the subject, and where you sit proportionally. That's what NISA are looking at. They're looking at where you sit compared to everybody else, and they're looking at the gaps between achievement so that they can maintain those gaps. So let's take a look at Mary's English results. What's going to matter for her moderated assessment results is going to be how far she is from the person who came first, how far she is from the other people who are either side of her, and how far she is from the class average. So when Mary's school English assessment marks are moderated, they're moderated according to the performance of the school and everybody in Mary's school in the English HSC exam. So the top HSC exam mark becomes the top school assessment mark for English. The bottom HSC exam mark usually becomes the bottom school assessment mark for English, and the average school exam mark becomes the average exam mark for the assessment tasks. Then, once all those three things are known, everybody else's, so not the top and not the bottom, but everybody else in the class or in the school's assessment marks can be moderated according to that performance in the exam. It is worth just quickly noting that whoever gets the top exam mark won't necessarily get the top assessment mark, and whoever gets the top assessment mark won't necessarily get the top exam mark. But the way it works is that whoever gets the highest assessment mark, the number one ranking in the school submitted to NISA, they will get the highest exam mark for their assessment mark, no matter whether that exam is theirs or not. So no one is guaranteed to have a certain ranking either in the exams or the assessments, except if you came first in the assessment, then you will maintain first in the assessment. If you came first in the exam, you will maintain first in the exam. But if you came first in the assessment and 10th in the exam, well then you probably won't maintain your first place ranking in the school for the actual HSC mark. Okay, so back to Mary now. And in her HSC exam, she did quite well, but not as well as she did in her school assessments. So her exam mark for the HSC turned out to be 84. And when that is compared to the school's assessments maximum and minimum and the average, and it all gets worked out, then her school assessment mark at a ranking of 3 was 92. So to get a final HSC mark, all they do is they take Mary's exam mark and the assessment mark and find the average of the two. So her final HSC mark for English Advanced was 88. So Mary now has an HSC score for each one of her HSC subjects. NISA, having calculated her HSC scores, are now done with them, and they send them off to UAC so they can be scaled and ATAR scores can be calculated. When it comes to scaling, there are two things that I want to talk about. One of them is calculating the scaled average mark for each course, and the other is calculating the scaled maximum mark available for each course. So we'll go through those. Once we've talked about those, then we can talk about actually allocating an ATAR to Mary. So the first thing is calculating the average scaled score in each subject, and we'll use biology as an example. So Mary studied biology along with a whole lot of other students in her school and a whole lot of other students in the state. In fact, biology is very popular and over 18,000 students study the course. So in order to calculate an average scaled mark for the subject, and this average scaled mark is for all of New South Wales, they take the results of every biology student in every subject except for biology, and they just add them all up. So for 18,000 students, you're talking many, many thousands of results, and whatever the average is of all those thousands of scaled scores in all their other subjects other than biology, that becomes the scaled average of biology. Extension subjects work a little bit differently, so we'll take a look at English Extension 1. Mary studied English Extension 1 along with other students in her school and about 3,500 or a little bit more than 3,500 other students. For extension subjects, we only take the scaled score of the base 2-unit subject into account when we're calculating the average scaled score for the course. So for Extension 1 English, we take every Extension 1 English student's results in Advanced English, and then we average those out. And whatever those results, the average of those results from Advanced English is, that becomes the scaled average score for English Extension 1. And now each subject has a scaled average score and with it a standard deviation. So all we need now is to calculate the maximum scaled score available for each subject. So to calculate the maximum scaled score available for each subject, UAC uses English as a base. It is important to note straight away that the maximum scaled score available for each subject is not determined by the highest achieving students in that subject. It's actually determined by the average and by English. So what UAC does is they take all 2-unit English scores. So it includes your Advanced English and your Standard English and your English Studies and your English EALD. They take all the students who study those 4 English subjects, which should pretty much be everybody, and then they find the average scaled score for all of English. Then all they do is they calculate the distance from the average score to the maximum score, and they calculate that in standard deviations. So however many standard deviations it is from the average score to the maximum score, that becomes the number of standard deviations applied to every single other subject. So in 2019, that was 2.46 standard deviations. So if we just take a look at what that looks like in physics, for example, then the average scaled score in physics was 30.9. And when you count 2.46 standard deviations from that average and you count up, then you get to a score that's beyond 50. So for physics, the maximum scaled score then comes back to 50, because for scaled scores, they're from 0 to 50, and you can't go past that 50 mark. And so the maximum scaled score for anybody in physics was 50. And what that means is that there will be at least one student in physics who achieves that maximum score. So when the maximum scores are set, somebody gets that maximum score. If we have a look at investigating science, on the other hand, then it's a slightly different story. So the average scaled score for investigating science was significantly lower than physics at 18.7. So for that subject, when you count 2.46 standard deviations above the mean, it only gets you to a scaled score of 43.5. So that means that the maximum scaled score in 2020 available to anybody in investigating science was 43.5, which is a bit lower than the maximum score available in physics and chemistry and biology and earth. Now, that doesn't mean that investigating science can't be an excellent contributor to students' ATAR scores. It definitely can, and I've got other videos to explain how that works and why. But it is important to understand that there are limitations to the maximum scores available in some subjects. So now if we go back and take a look at Mary's subjects, then every subject has a scaled average and a maximum scaled score. Now we're finally ready to allocate individual students' scaled scores and then work out their ATARs. So the process from here is really quite simple. Now Mary has a scaled score for each subject that she has studied. And here's where the units come into play. So for Mary, she studied 11 units and only her 10 best units will count for her ATAR. In terms of scaled scores, Maths Advanced was her best achieving subject, and so because that's worth 2 units, that 40.8 that was her scaled score for Maths Advanced will count twice when we're counting out the units, and because she studied English Extension 1, which is only 1 unit, that one can only count once, but all her other subjects will count twice as 2-unit subjects. So now that we've got the subjects split into their units, the worst achieving subject for Mary will be crossed off and won't count, as long as it's not one of your top 2 units of English. So 2 units of English have to count, and for Mary, that's not going to be a problem. Unfortunately, her Music 1 results were only just her lowest, and so for Mary, 1 unit of Music 1 will count, and the other unit will not count towards her ATAR. And then Mary's final scaled score is simply all those top 10 units added together. So all that happens now is that everybody in New South Wales is ranked according to their scaled score. So from the highest scaled score in New South Wales down to the lowest scaled score in New South Wales, everybody is ranked, and Mary fits into that rank somewhere. So now everybody has received a scaled score, and those scaled scores are ranked. We're ready to actually give out ATAR scores. Now, the ATAR is just a ranking, and it's a percentile ranking, and it's an estimation of where you would sit if every single person who started Year 7 in New South Wales and the ACT actually received an ATAR. So the ATAR is just a percentile, and it includes everybody, whether they actually applied for and received an ATAR or not. So if you score an ATAR of 90, then you are in the 90th percentile of all New South Wales and ACT students. If you score an ATAR of 50, then you are academically estimated to be right in the middle of all students in New South Wales and the ACT. It's really that simple. And the way that I like to think about how ATARs are given out is by thinking of it as buckets. So in 2019 and in 2020, the top 49 students in New South Wales and the ACT received an ATAR of 99.95. That is to say that there are, because ATARs are given out in 0.05 increments, all that happens is that they take the top 49 students and they score 99.95. Then they take the next 49 students and they score 99.9. And then they take the next 49 students and they get 99.85. And the next 49 after that get 99.8, and so on. And each time we have a bucket that has that is worth 0.05 ATAR increment, and 49 students can fit in there each time. Now, the lower the ATAR scores get, the more spaces are kept free for students who didn't actually receive an ATAR, but if they had applied, we're estimating they would fit there. And that's really it. That is how the ATAR scores are calculated. So now we're back to Mary and looking at her final ATAR score, and when we're thinking about all those scaled scores being split up into those buckets, then her bucket is 88.3. So Mary's final ATAR score is 88.3. It's not quite as high as she'd hoped, but it is an exceptional score and something she can be really proud of.